3 for my audience, 2 live, and there is 1 currently on FaceTime. The automobile, a fast and efficient machine that we take for granted. We use it every day to run simple errands or simply to go meet with friends. The automobile has been in use since the early 1910s and has seen drastic changes in the 1960s. But how did cars go looking from the one on the left to the one on the right? As a person in a family with mechanics who have taught me about cars, I can teach you how cars went from simple little engines to big gas-guzzling cars. Before gasoline-powered engines, there were steam and electric, but they were inefficient and very expensive, which people couldn't afford. Cars usually looked like this. This is a 1913 Model T, and it was very simple. It had an engine, just wheels, some basic leather seats, and some lights. And it was for a good reason. According to the National Museum of American History, cities usually had decent roads, but rural roads were often little more than muddy trails, as you can see right here. It was just mud, and cars had to be able to go through mud, rocks, hills, anything that got in their way. And roads got better as people started accepting automobiles, but technology stayed pretty stagnant. This is what cars looked like around this era. There were 3 pedals, there was a big brake right here, and you had to turn it on from the front with a big lever, and keys didn't come around until 1916. So you had to turn it on from the front until around 1916. And this technology was used up until the 1930s when cars had a new revolution. Gone are the days of 4-cylinder motors and basic interiors. According to Bertram Simon, who was a writer for Supercars.net, cars began to take on a smoother shape, more aerodynamic in design, which can be seen in this 1934 Ford Deluxe V8, which is an 8-cylinder with a really luxurious interior. People didn't want something basic. They wanted luxury. They wanted big motors like an 8, a 12, or even a 16-cylinder sometimes. This was very aerodynamic, which was a trend around that time. And the new technology started to come around. Radios cost around $130, so only the rich could afford around this time. And there were also air coolers in the 30s, as you can see right here. You basically put water and air would go through it, and that is how the temperature would be lowered inside the cabin. And around 1940, the company called Packard made the basic compressor air conditioning, which is what we use today, but it wasn't in use for much long because World War II came along and any civilian cars were no longer in production. So people had to stay with their old cars from around 1940 to 1945, which is a pretty long time, and people wanted something new. And this is how they used the assembly lines for wartime. And then came the 1950s. World War II came to an end, and America began to crave a new car. At this time, people began to move to the suburbs and needed big family cars. Cars of the 1930s had big defined fenders and they were very aerodynamic. And in the 1950s, they got rid of those big fenders, they added a little more chrome, and they were a bit lower, which was a really big design change. And they also added fins. According to Heather McKinney, who was a writer for It Still Runs, which is a car website, states that tail fins appeared in the beginning of the decade and grew to outlandish proportions. Some fins in the back were even a foot tall, and they were meant to represent spaceships and even jets, which was really popular around that time. You can see right here, there was a little chromed jet, which was popular in the early 50s. And there was also new technology like the automatic transmission and the air conditioner, which was invented in the 40s, but it wasn't made popular until the 50s because World War II didn't allow people to use that type of technology. And then 1950 came to an end, and the 1960s came along. People didn't want these outlandish cars with the huge fins in the back and an excess amount of chrome and interiors that are just too wacky. They wanted something simpler, and that is what car companies had to do. As you can see, this 1958 Lincoln Continental was much different than this 1966. The 1966 is just a bit more simple and a little more elegant, and that is what people of the time wanted. You can see here the interior is also really different. They used to use a little more bright colors right here, and right here they were just a bit more toned down. And another important thing you could see right here is the seatbelt, which became a standard equipment in the 1960s that most people refused to use, according to henryford.org, a website dedicated to American history. 1960s also became concerned with safety. Sports cars and muscle cars also became popular when Chevrolet released the Camaro, and they still continued production with the Corvette. Ford released the Mustang, and Dodge released the Challenger and the Charger. In just 60 years, cars went looking from this to the one on the right. Cars have become embedded in our daily lives and will continue to do so. Now I invite you to think about how much work was involved for you to be able to drive the car you have today. Thank you.